Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are going to talk about intimate partner violence in teen dating relationships. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Michelle Jewett. Michelle uses she, her pronouns and has been a prevention educator at SafeHouse, the domestic violence shelter of Seminole County, since 2011. She was awarded Victim Advocate of the Year in 2013 from the Office of the State Attorney, 18th Judicial Court, as well as the Voice of Hope Award 2016 from the Seminole County Domestic Violence Task Force. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology from UCF. Michelle has 5 children of her own, ranging from 16-year-olds to 28, happily ever after with her husband of almost 30 years, and hopes for a time when everyone can have the same dream become a reality. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy speaking about domestic violence, which is a weird thing to say, but I really do.
Thank you so much. I understand that as a fellow education coordinator. And I also have Heather Wilkie. Heather uses she, her pronouns and has served as the executive director for Zebra Coalition, an organization whose mission is to support and inspire LGBTQ youth. Zebra Coalition operates a youth drop-in center in Orlando, Florida, that serves as a safe space and programming for hundreds of youth ages 13 to 24. Zebra Coalition also provides housing for youth experiencing homelessness. Prior to her work at Zebra Coalition, Mrs. Wilkie served as Chief Operating Officer for Harbor House of Central Florida, where she was responsible for the development and monitoring of programs for one of the largest and most comprehensive domestic abuse organizations in the United States. Mrs. Wilkie holds a master's degree in mental health counseling from Rollins College. Mrs. Wilkie has received numerous awards for her work, including Harbor House of Central Florida's Champion of Equality and one of Orlando Magazine's 2018 Women of the Year. So Heather, thank you as well for joining us today.
Thank you, Emilie. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you guys today.
I'm really excited to have this conversation too. And as a really brief introduction, according to the Center for Disease Control, intimate partner violence affects millions of teens in the U.S. each year. In fact, 26% of women and 15% of men actually experienced intimate partner violence for the first time before the age of 18. However, when we think of things, I think, like domestic violence and dating violence, as a society, we rarely, if ever, talk about teen victims or survivors. So what we are looking to explore in this episode is why teen dating violence isn't taken seriously, barriers teens and specifically those in the LGBTQ plus community have when it comes to reporting and seeking help, resources for youth survivors, and how we can advocate for the teens in our lives who are experiencing or have experienced intimate partner violence. So with that in mind, I wanted to kind of start off with this question regarding, the difference between intimate partner violence and domestic violence. So what is intimate partner violence, and is it different than domestic violence? And if so, how?
That's a good question. The legal term domestic violence is any family or household member. And so it's usually when you're living together, and that can be child to parent, sibling to sibling. If grandma lives with you and she's in an altercation with you, that's domestic. But when we say intimate partner violence, that is just a narrower focus of that, where it is an intimate partner, but that can also not only be a spouse, but a dating partner as well.
And for younger kids, the teenage category, I think that it's a more inclusive and specific way of defining that, because most young people are not going to be residing in the same home as their person that they're dating. And so I know that when working with youth, we use IPV, intimate partner violence, a lot more than domestic violence.
Thank you so much for both of you for breaking that down. That makes a lot of sense. And it kind of leads to my next question. So why is it important to talk about IPV with teens specifically?
Yeah, well, because we know that it's absolutely something that young people experience. I was just looking over in preparation for this podcast, but we teach this a lot. We use the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is a survey that is compiled among young people in the school system every year. And you can actually look up the Florida data, and what we know is that we're seeing somewhere between 8 and 14% of all young people have said and indicated on the survey that they've experienced intimate partner violence, and the way that they phrase it is more about the person that they're dating, but they've experienced that. And so it's very concerning, it's very real, and we need to be here talking about it.
Yeah, when you look at that, it really does also show that it starts early. There are middle school students that are experiencing it. So it's not just these high schoolers and older high schoolers. This is starting young. And so if we're not having this conversation, we're just compounding the abusive behaviors that happen and people who are suffering at the hands of someone who says, I love you.
Yeah, this is all really important data. I really appreciate you sharing that, Heather. So is that data like Orange County specifically that you're reading, or?
So it's actually across the state of Florida, the Florida Youth Risk Behavior Survey. I do pull it out of Orange County, so you can actually get that data for OCPS, Seminole County Public Schools. They break it down by county, but it is compiled statewide, and actually national data is available as well.
And how is Florida compared to the national data? Do you know? Is it?
I would say that it's pretty similar when you're talking about this topic. So the data is actually the risk behavior survey that looks at all healthy and unhealthy behaviors. So this is just one category, but you can do some comparison work, and Florida is about the same as compared to other states.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to ask, when we talk about things like IPV and domestic violence, we hear a lot about looking out for red flags. So, Michelle, I wanted to ask you, what are some of those red flags, and are there any ones specific for teen relationships?
Oh, yeah, it's really important to kind of understand that, and it's something that we work a lot with youth on, because a lot of the behaviors can sound like love at first. And a lot of the behaviors are even romanticized in like rom-coms and music. When translated into real life, it's not love. And so it's important to talk about this because it's the I love you so much that I get jealous when, and those are like ding, ding, dings, right? Because there should be trust in a relationship. And a lot of people think, oh, if they're jealous, it means that they do love me and they do care. And where jealousy is a natural feeling, right? It is okay to feel jealous. Your feelings are valid. But it's what we do with them that can often lead to unhealthy and abusive behaviors. And so we have to be mindful of that, where they want to control who you hang out with, where you go, what you can wear. And those are signs of an unhealthy and abusive relationship. And so to keep those in mind, it's really important, because it gets mixed up a lot with love. Or I have trust issues. We'll hear that a lot. I have trust issues, so I need to check your messages. And really, again, it's if you're not healed from your past relationship because of trust, then let's not start a new one. And because your issues from your past shouldn't be part of our new relationship, but we just kind of accept that sometimes. Well, I understand, they were cheated on, so that they need to just check up on me just to make sure. And then that can, again, compound to more and more control over your life.
Right. That makes sense. And are there specific ones for teens that you wanted to bring up, or are they pretty similar to what we see in adult intimate partner relationships?
There are many, I think, that are just as similar as adult relationships. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that it really does, start young, those same patterns. And it's a lot about not respecting your boundaries, because we all have our boundaries, what we're comfortable with, what we're not. And sometimes they do shift in relationships, and that's a normal kind of compromising and shifting. But if you're sticking up for your boundary and your partner's making you feel guilty for having this boundary, or you don't love me enough because you don't, it could be sexual boundaries. If you really loved me, you would. That happens, or spending all your time together to isolate you from friends. So there's really a lot of parallels between the adult and the teen. I think more in the teens, there's a lot of digital abuse that happens, but then we also see that in the adult relationships as well. So it is interesting when you break down a lot of it, it's just parallels the adult relationships.
It does make sense. And I think that it's kind of highlighting the fact that, we don't think that teens go through serious things such as IPV. And we're seeing that even the red flags are even similar as to adult relationships too. I think that's really important to highlight that. So I thank you so much. As always, I think one of the biggest issues also surrounding intimate partner violence in teen relationships is that we as a society, like I mentioned, don't take it seriously. So even so, research shows that teens experience IPV frequently, like I mentioned. So for example, also according to the CDC, nearly 1 in 11 female and approximately 1 in 15 male high school students report having experienced physical dating violence in the last year. So with that, why do you think we as a society do not take IPV and teen relationships seriously? And this could be either you or Heather can jump in.
Yeah, I can start it off. I think that one major thing that we talk about when working with young people is just not taking young people seriously in general, right? Because we think, well, as adults, and a lot of times we use the term adultism, are we looking at this through a lens of, well, I'm an adult and therefore I know better, or I'm wiser, or your relationship is not as significant. And so when you're looking at IPV, not taking it seriously is very valid, and it's important because sometimes we just dismiss these behaviors. To Michelle's point, it's very much mimics oftentimes adults. These behaviors that start out really early in life that can sometimes be in very short-lived relationships, right? But I can start out in a couple of months of a relationship with someone at age 15, and those behaviors start to build. And so even though the relationship may not last as long, it could still last long, but typically may not last as long, we have to take it seriously. And I also wanted to point out the importance of the social aspect when it comes to IPV in young people. Social interaction is so important for adolescents. And so using things like isolating you from your friends, or, in LGBTQ youth relationships, sometimes outing you to people who you aren't necessarily out to, whether that's friends or family, or using the power of social media to humiliate you, and to, call you out, name calling, controlling, all of those behaviors. It's very similar to adult relationships, but when you're younger, those social aspects mean so much more to you. And so, or it's just a very different way of seeing things, right? And if you think about ourselves at age 15, 16, how important it was for us to feel liked, or to be in a crowd and feel like we belong. And so a lot of times in those younger relationships, we use those things, abusers use those things to further isolate and abuse their victims.
Most definitely. And a lot of times people just think, oh, we'll just break up. Right. And we hear that whether it's teen or even young adults who are dating, just break up and the abuse will stop. You know, you're not living together, so just break up. And it's really not that simple, you know, for anyone to just break up. And there's breakup violence. If they're going to school together, they have to still see that person. And it's harder to get away. And with technology, the abuser just doesn't leave them alone, even if they try to break up. And so to keep that in mind when we're talking about, you know, not taking it seriously and just saying, oh, well, just break up. Don't see that person anymore. It's okay. There are other people out there you can date, you know, and not understanding how difficult it can be to make that break, even if you're not living together. It's a challenge and it's dangerous.
I think all of those are such fantastic points to bring up that, yeah, I think in general, we don't take youth seriously, for sure. And also, I didn't even think of that aspect of I remember, you know, when I was a teen, the importance of that social aspect. That was the center of my world for a long time. And that really does put them at risk for things like social control. And it makes a lot of sense. And also thinking of having to go to school with this person. That's really difficult to even imagine. So yeah, I love all the points that you both brought up. And always, you know, I shared a lot of statistics. It's also important to highlight that when sharing statistics, that these are only reported numbers, of course. So this is only what we know of. So do you think teens are more or less likely to report IPV when compared to adults?
You know, I think that's interesting because in some ways, young people are more vocal, and it's harder in some ways to hide things, I think, when you're younger. But at the same time, we also know that a lot of times, it's hard to measure whether or not you would be more vocal about an abusive relationship when you're younger. I think it depends on who you're trusting and how many adults you have in your life who you can trust, or friendships who you could rely on for feedback. So it's back to what adults in your life do you have that relationship with? You know, can you talk to your parents? Do you have an aunt? Do you have one supportive person? We talk about that a lot for the LGBTQ population. The younger that you are, if you don't have family support, the more isolated you are. But if you only have one person, whether it's a teacher or, you know, someone who you can go to feel comfortable, then you're more likely to speak out. And so when we're talking about intimate partner violence, I think it takes that trust. Whereas as adults, we tend to have that. You know, we tend to have someone as an older person, you know, who we can talk to about situations. So I think it depends. I think it depends on your social support.
Yeah, definitely. And also the age, because there are a lot of young people that aren't allowed to date. And so they can't talk to their parents. We had a young woman in middle school who was experiencing abuse in her relationship. It was a lot of controlling behavior, not a lot of what she said, physical violence, just little things. And she was talking to her friends about it, and her friends were trying to help her through it and help to give her support and strength to break up with this young man. But he didn't take no for an answer and was harassing her, threatening her, and she was afraid. And it took him actually getting his neighbor's gun before she was able to get her mom involved. And then she was able to move forward. But she was afraid of this young man, but she was also afraid of her parents' reactions to know that she was dating behind their backs. And so she was kind of caught in the middle. But finally, when he escalated, and that fear was greater than the fear of her parents' response. And so I think there are some young people that are kind of caught in that in between as well, who maybe they're not out to their parents and they do have a same-sex relationship. And so if they report it, then they'll be outing themselves. Or it could be someone who isn't old enough to date or isn't allowed to date. And again, they'll have to tell on themselves to get help, and they could kind of be stuck in that situation. And to keep that in mind, that a lot of times, you know, when we're working with young people, they have that fear of reporting because of different situations that may be happening in their lives with their parents.
Yeah, those are all really important barriers to highlight. I think that there is a big fear too, like you were mentioning earlier about how, remembering when I was a teen that my social world was my center. I was also really afraid to get in trouble. So that is also kind of acting as a barrier too for people. And are there other barriers, do you think, in general, people just not taking it seriously could be a barrier to reporting probably? Any other barriers you want to bring up, maybe specific to the LGBTQ plus community? I know we talked about outing, but anything else you want to bring up before we move on?
Outing or using information, not just outing you, but using information that they may have to, potentially use it as a threat, right? So not just outing in the sense of I'm going to tell people that you're gay or that, but also like I'm going to tell people that you like this, or that, for transgender young people, if you're not out in that way, I'm going to tell someone that you're changing clothes when you get to school. So it's not just like outing you wholly, it's outing parts of you, right? And I think that's an important piece because some people think, okay, well, it's just you're telling on me because I'm out, but there's a lot more to that. And there's different ways that you can control someone because of that. And so I could get really deep into that, but I think the most important thing is that there's isolation involved. There could potentially be humiliation, and then also just having that control.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I didn't even think of it that way. So I wanted to talk a little bit about if there were any differences between intimate partner violence and teen dating relationships from adult relationships that we should be mindful of. I know we talked a little bit about how similar they are. Are there any differences that we need to highlight?
I think a big thing is we give it a cute name, breakup violence, right? But we have to be, mindful of that with these youth. Like we mentioned earlier, they're still in school. They still have connections to these partners that they may break up with. And oftentimes we're telling our youth, it's so rude to break up over text, never break up over text. And we need to let them know, like, it's okay if you don't feel safe to break up over text, and that you don't owe someone one last goodbye or anything like that, because a lot of the fatalities in teen dating violence have been because the abuser said, well, I just want one last goodbye. I want to see you one more time. Let's exchange our stuff in person. And that puts the youth at risk. And so I think it's important that we let youth know that it's okay to say no. And it's okay if you don't feel safe to break up over text, or if you feel like you have to break up in person or meet that one last time, to do it in a very public place and not be alone because of the danger that is out there.
I think that's a really good point. I would also say that because of the age, I think there's an opportunity to make sure that we're educating young people. If they have experienced abuse and they're able to survive that experience, we have an opportunity to sort of end that track for them, right? Because we do know that this is a cycle. We know that there are generations of young people who are growing up and experiencing violence in their relationships because that's what they've witnessed from their parents. And so I think that when you're talking about young people, we have an opportunity to change that cycle. And that may involve linking them with experts like advocates in the field and making sure that we're talking to them at an early age to stop this from happening further into their adulthood.
Yeah, and that's so awesome that you say that, Heather, because a lot of times we focus on the victim or survivor, and it's so important at a young age to also think about those who exhibit that abusive behavior, because we do have that opportunity for change. And so it is thinking about both people in that relationship that could use that help to have a better future.
Heather, I also wanted to ask, are queer and unhealthy abusive relationships viewed differently by society than heterosexual relationships?
Absolutely. And great question. I think that a lot of it stems back from gender norms, from what we feel about what men and women, if you're thinking about binary system and males and females and how they should behave and what they should be doing. So when you see, for example, two men in a relationship who are being violent toward one another, or one person is more controlling and taking on that, we don't necessarily associate it with IPV or domestic violence. And not always is it taken seriously by law enforcement. We work a lot with, different systems to try to change that way of thinking, but we still have areas of concern for even centers like, homeless centers or hotline calls where people are assuming that you have a partner who is a male or female based on how you sound or how you look. And so it's lessened then because you're talking about a very oppressed group in general. And so there's a lot of systems to say about that. But it does not mean that just because you're two women in a relationship that you are 100% healthy or not controlling the other person or not in an abusive relationship. And so I think it goes back to that attachment on gender norms and how we need to shift that first and foremost, because we all know that two people, regardless of their gender, can be victimized and also have the power to abuse another person.
Yeah, and it's always important to highlight that too, because there are, of course, in a heterosexual relationship, men can also be the victims and women can also be the perpetrators as well. And yeah, I think that when we think of things like domestic violence and intimate partner violence, we often think of a male abuser and a female victim, and then survivors are kind of left out, male survivors, LGBTQ plus survivors. And so you're absolutely right. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Michelle, were there any common myths that you'd like to actually debunk about teen IPV?
I think one of the things that I would like to say is that abusers do not look like abusers. They can be the school heroes. And I think that's what's really hard when we talked about that social aspect of school life, is it could be the school quarterback or class president, and that can make it harder to be able to come out and say it's happening to me, or even to break up because you have that social pressure. Oh, you're so lucky to have this person like you, to be in a relationship with you, and you're thinking, well, if I'm so lucky, then why is this happening? There must be something wrong with me.
Thank you so much. So with that, are those who live in abusive households more likely to be in abusive relationships themselves? I think that that's something that we talk about a lot when we talk about survivors of abuse. So I wanted to check in with that as well.
There is generational abuse where it can be passed down because you learn that role to play at home, but that's not always the case. There are many people who grow up in abusive homes and say, this is not what I want. And they learn what behaviors to replace. And I think that's really important. If you say, I don't want to be like that, then you have to find that behavior that you want to replace it with and learn that replacement behavior, because we all kind of naturally go towards our norm. And so if we want to make those changes. But there are also people who grow up in healthy homes, and they have experiences in their relationships that might change us. So if you were cheated on in a relationship, beforehand, you might have thought, no, you can't look at your partner's phone. You can't control who your partner talks to. But then those trust issues that you have can often shift your way of thinking about relationships. And you might think, oh, well, now I need to do that. And it can be more of an learned behavior. Or it can be, movies, music that kind of give us a new norm. Well, this is the way relationships are now. I hear that a lot. This is just the way that it is now. You don't understand because it's their norm. And so helping them shift away and to see a different way is important.
Absolutely. In relation to that, I wanted to kind of delve into if there were any common misconceptions regarding IPV in LGBTQ plus teen relationships, particularly there's this myth I've heard of mutual abuse in LGBTQ plus relationships. And so I wanted to kind of delve into some misconceptions that you wanted to highlight, Heather.
Yeah, so, with young people in general, and I think if you're adding on that layer of coming out and being young in LGBTQ, I mean, at some point they're going to be coming out in that process, right? And they may both be in the closet together. They may be, in varying ways, out in different ways, out to their friends on some level and out to their parents. So I think that adds on another layer of stress. And I think it's important to point that out, that LGBTQ young people are also dealing with a lot of other stress and a lot of other challenges in terms of acceptance. And so in addition to that, you have this relationship that may end up being a little bit more, I don't want to use the word codependent because it's so overused, but it may be a little more intense, right? Intensified because they're both going through this very huge experience of their lives together at a young age. So because of that, I think there could be a perception of this mutual abuse concept. For the most part, though, when we're teaching about domestic violence and when we're educating the public, we talk about who has more of the power and control within a relationship. And that is certainly not unique to the young experience. And so while you may have a situation where, yes, you can both be, kind of mutually not as respectful as maybe a healthier relationship could be, I don't think that's specific to the LGBTQ community. And so I think that that's a little bit of another sort of myth that could further perpetuate negative stereotypes in many ways. But I think it's important to kind of pull out that concept of mutual abuse. What does that look like? What does it mean? It's certainly not out of the picture. It's not necessarily something that doesn't happen, but more so you have one person in a relationship who's going to have more power and more control. And so when we talk about abuse, that's more what we're talking about.
When we talk about abuse and domestic violence and intimate partner violence, there's lots of different types of abuse. And you were highlighting it, you were talking about digital abuse, social as well. So I wanted to ask, could you go over any differences between things like mental or physical abuse in relationships?
Yeah, mental abuse often is what starts, and that can be emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and we call it abuse and violence, even though it's not physical, because it is violence to the core of who you are as a human. And that's behaviors that can be like little things, picking out all your flaws, all your mistakes. And we all kind of have a negative self-talk that we do. And when your partner voices those things that you already tell yourself, your insecurities, your doubts, your mistakes, all those things can become weapons and to the core of who you really are. And so that mental, emotional abuse is very damaging. A lot of times we don't take that as seriously, but if you can tear down the soul of a person, then they are going to be more susceptible to then the physical violence that happens and feeling that blame and shame, like it is all my fault. I'm not worthy. At least this person loves me. Who else is going to love me? And it can trap them in that relationship, which is heartbreaking, but it's tearing apart your value, your self-worth. And with the physical violence, often with the youth, it starts off little things, having your partner walk around with their arm around you, and the rest of the world can think, oh, look, they're together. But really, the abusive partner is giving you pinches on the back of your arm anytime someone looks at you, because you must be attracting attention. And it can be little things like that. And then it can definitely increase severity, frequency. And so it's important to pay attention to anything that doesn't feel right. Oftentimes we see those little behaviors, whether they're the physical or even the emotional abuse, will increase in severity and frequency. And so we usually tell the youth, pay attention to those little things, because you don't know what they're going to build to. So it's okay to talk about those little things and put up your boundaries and say what you're not comfortable with. It really is those little red flags that they do matter.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for highlighting all of that. That's really all really important stuff. Heather, I wanted to, talk about, one of the things I go over in my healthy relationships training is the power and control wheel, which we've kind of been talking about here, which essentially highlights tactics abusers use in order to control or manipulate another person. We talked about how outing can be a form of abuse. Are there any specific tactics that relate to IPV in teen LGBTQ plus relationships? For example, the fear of being outed and how it is used as a tactic of coercion for teens.
Yeah, I would say that that's the biggest difference if you were looking at LGBTQ young people versus non-LGBTQ IPV situations is that that threat and what that means depending on where they are in their lives. I mean, if you think about it, if you're looking at someone who really cannot be out to their family or they will get kicked out of their homes, which is a reality that we see in my organization, and the threat of that and the magnitude of that, the weight that you may experience, whether or not you stay in a relationship because of that, could potentially further cause, an abusive situation to get worse. And so I think it's not something that we take lightly. We want to make sure that we're reaching young people. And then another thing that hasn't been brought up a lot that I wanted to point out was just the use of sexual assault and sexual violence in young IPV relationships, because we're all kind of exploring our sexuality at that age anyway. Oftentimes in abusive relationships, there may be some boundary issues and consent issues. And I think that extends to the LGBTQ community even more so, because there isn't a ton of information about healthy sexual relationships for the LGBTQ population. And so I think it just further stigmatizes and creates these barriers when you really don't know who to reach out to for information about safe sex, because a lot of times safe sex programs are heteronormative. And it just further, complicates the situation. It can create more abusive scenarios. And then also just the lack of information can cause harm in general.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What I'm hearing is that there's a lot of different tactics and systems at play here that isolate teen survivors, specifically in the LGBTQ plus community as well. So that isolation just further puts them at risk for things like violence and specifically teen dating violence and IPV. So thank you for highlighting all of that. Kind of shifting gears into more healthy relationships, as the prevention educator at SafeHouse, Michelle, what are some things that you like to highlight in your training specifically with teens about healthy relationships?
Well, I love to bring music and lyrics into all of my trainings. I think it's so relatable. Music is a big part of all of our lives. And so I bring in current music that the youth are listening to, and we look at the lyrics and say, okay, well, now what is this saying about relationships? Does anything stand out? Because often when you look at lyrics versus just hearing them, you don't even realize what the message is. And when they start looking at lyrics and start thinking about, wait, is this, what I really want in a relationship? And then I always twist it around. Well, what do you think should happen instead? Or what do you think would be a healthy way of expressing yourself? And so it's having them brainstorm healthy behaviors that make sense to them, that are comfortable for them. Because sometimes as adults, we can be a little clinical sometimes about, well, this is the way to do it. And it's not something that's comfortable or natural for the youth to do. And so helping them brainstorm their natural way of handling a situation in a relationship. So it's really important to understand them and where they're coming from, and then help them figure out a healthier way. I never say a better way or, wow, that's really abusive what you were doing. Can you believe, that behavior? It's helping them understand, is there a different way of handling this that might be more respectful for my partner or for myself?
I love that. Are there any other tips that you would like to give for specifically caregivers or people who have teens in their lives when it comes to talking about IPV and DV in relationships with youth?
I always say start early and have conversations. It's not a one-time lecture. And it's the same with any behavior, drinking and driving, drug use and abuse. It's starting young and making it conversational, and enjoy having these conversations with your youth. And by starting young, it's watching a lot of the kids shows. Little kids shows will have some sort of relationship aspect in them, and they're not always promoting healthy behaviors just to do anything for a laugh. And so kids are laughing at some of these behaviors that it's okay to have a conversation like, what did you think about that? Do you think that that was a good way to handle that situation? And so it's talking to them young, listening to the radio in the car and listening to what your teens are listening to, and having them, look up the lyrics and have a conversation about that. So it's easy to have these conversations and not have them be lectures. Really listen to them. It's really important.
Got it. Thank you so much. Heather, was there anything you wanted to bring up?
I just think for the LGBTQ population, it's important to link them with organizations or, support systems that understand the specific, differences in nature to what it's like to be a young person and coming out and exploring their sexuality or gender. So I think that's the difference that I would point out when working with young queer people, is that, you really have to have that community and that connection. And so I would encourage that from anybody who is, seeing someone who may be struggling or maybe potentially in an abusive relationship at a young age. But many of the dynamics that Michelle mentioned are still very relevant to our population as well.
Speaking of those specific, dynamics that you were mentioning, of course, trust and honesty are both really essential in all healthy relationships. But with that in mind, are there some struggles that the teen queer relationships or teen relationships in the LGBTQ plus community face regarding trust and honesty if they are not out to other people?
I do think that sometimes they're navigating their own self to a point where it may be unclear what trust and what honesty could look like. There isn't so much. I think this is shifting more, of course, the more generational gaps we have and the more people we have who are coming out and the more media representation. But if you don't have a role model to look at, and you don't have many role models to look at what it means to have a healthy relationship and also have a queer relationship, I think that it creates a lot more challenges. But that is hopefully lessening. We have many more people who are openly out. We have, in a positive light, social media can do a lot of great things for connecting community and connecting young people with like-minded social situations and intimate partner relationships. So to that degree, I think that we're in a much more positive situation when it comes to support than we were even 5 years ago. And so, I think it goes both ways, but I certainly think that there needs to be more support in this way, specific to our population. That's the only difference I would say.
Got it. Thanks so much for highlighting all of that. Really, that makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. I also wanted to mention, I talk a lot about in my trainings why people may stay in abusive relationships. And I think as supporters and as a society, it's important we highlight reasons why survivors do stay in these relationships so we can better understand and support them. So with that in mind, are there any specific reasons as to why teens stay in abusive relationships that you wanted to highlight?
Well, I would say because sometimes it can be more normalized the younger that we are. We don't necessarily know the difference. And so if I think that by this person spending so much time with me or wanting for me to only spend time with them or wanting to pick out the clothing that I'm wearing or the friends I'm hanging out with, if I associate that with love and I'm more likely to do that if I have less experience in relationships, then that normalizes it. And so therefore I wouldn't know the difference to not stay. And so that's why we have to ask the questions that can help us as adults, help our young people sort of see what healthy and unhealthy can look like. But certainly I think you could stay in a relationship for longer just because you don't really know the difference all the time.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Yeah, that normalized behavior. And also what's normalized in society is this need to be in a relationship. Like that is what gives you value. The whole saying like, oh, you complete me or whatever else is out there, and you feel like your value comes from being in a relationship. And so if you're alone, that must mean that you're not valued, you're not lovable. And so we have to let people know, our youth know, like it's okay to not be in a relationship. Don't feel that pressure to have a partner, that you have value, you're whole and complete all on your own. And I think that's important because nobody has this feeling of, I want to be alone, right? We're always, I want to be in a relationship. And even those who are aromantic, that they don't want this attraction, may feel that pressure to fit in, to belong in a relationship. And that can be a danger, that need to be in. And especially if you share the same friend group, it can make it hard to break up and leave. And, we mentioned before the breakup violence, that fear is the same for our teens. And we have to be aware of that and make sure we're not just encouraging them to leave without helping them safety plan just like we would adults.
Absolutely. And speaking of, that safety plan and teens reaching out to people in their lives for support, where can a teen go if they don't feel safe at home to talk about their safety when it comes to IPV?
They can always reach out. Hopefully they'll have a trusted adult either at school or maybe a friend's parent, but it can be hard for youth who don't have a parent or guardian that they can talk to, because many resources can't work with minors without that permission by their parent or guardian. Loveisrespect.org does have online chat. They have text and phone that they can call for support in safety planning. If they do not disclose their age on a domestic violence hotline, then they can get that support talk and safety planning. But I do believe it is a challenge for youth to know where to go, but they are never alone. Again, that loveisrespect.org is a great resource all over the country.
Thank you for highlighting that. I didn't even think about the fact that they need a parent or guardian's, input a lot of times to get this support. So that's just another barrier. But thanks for highlighting loveisrespect.org. I have those in my trainings too, and it's a great resource. That being said, Heather, are there specific resources for LGBTQ plus youth who have been impacted by IPV?
Yes, and I would second Love is Respect, because I do know that they have had specific programming for LGBTQ young people. So I think that they definitely could help in the population. There's also an organization called Q Chat Space, qchatspace.org, and they provide chat opportunities for young people in the queer community and have had specific discussions about IPV, and it's actually facilitated by one of the mental health therapists on staff there. So I think that there are those sort of unique opportunities for our community, also connecting with organizations that have LGBTQ specific staff and do programming in that area. I think could be a tremendous support.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's always important to know that there are resources out there, that you aren't alone. So if you're listening and you have a friend or you yourself are experiencing this, those are some wonderful resources to start off with. I think we talked a lot about how we can better advocate for teens in our lives that may be experiencing IPV. Michelle, I wanted to ask if you had anything you wanted to add on to that.
We've talked about the youth being trapped sometimes in the same school. So I think it's important to point out that schools are required in the state of Florida, and I'm sure all over the country, to have a teen dating violence policy. In those teen dating violence policies, it includes things like the perpetrator is the one who's supposed to switch classes or change schools and to make all the adjustments. But often schools will do the path of least resistance and work on that survivor making those changes, to make those accommodations so that they don't have to get the perpetrator involved and the perpetrator's parents. So it's important as the adults in their lives to say, that that's not what we want, that it's not fair for this teen who has already experienced abuse to have to make all those adjustments and changes. So advocating at the school level to make sure that the abusive partner is the one who has to make those changes as per school policy.
Got it. Yeah, I didn't even think that I didn't know that there were teen dating violence policies in all schools. That's amazing. That's really great. Heather, how can we specifically help teens in the LGBTQ plus community that are experiencing IPV?
Well, I think, first of all, being an ally is important, and showing that you're an ally is important, whether we're talking about IPV or just, supporting the community in general. We do a lot of training in my organization to help provide information and education on the trends that we're seeing with young people, language that we're using, how to respect pronouns, how to support someone where they are in their coming out process. And so education is big, and I think that this is this is two different areas that we have to make sure people can understand and recognize the signs of abuse at a young age, the differences in what they look like. Things like listening to this podcast should be very helpful with that. And then following up to support them as allies.
I love that. That's so important, everything that you said. As a final question to both you, Michelle, and you, Heather, what are some things that we can all do, like as a society, as individuals, to help stop intimate partner violence in teen relationships?
For me, have those conversations early on, and it's not just with your children, but any youth you have contact with. To have those simple conversations, getting to understand what they view a healthy relationship, talk about healthy behaviors, model healthy behaviors is really important. Have their friends come together, organizations like SafeHouse and Zebra and Victim Service Center, we all have workshops on healthy relationships. And so make it fun for teens to get together and go to a workshop because they learn from their peers. So it's not just about teaching the youth in your life, but making sure their peers are educated. Share social media posts from different organizations and have that highlighting positive behaviors, I think, is important. And so just don't be afraid to have conversations, because conversations change lives, which can save lives.
I love that. Heather, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just can't stress the importance of education and having the discussions and making sure that our teachers are trained to recognize signs. Even as parents, we aren't always seeing what our kids are doing, right? They're spending the majority of their time in school and online. And so being able to safely monitor that and help guide our young people into understanding what it is to have a healthy and a non-healthy relationship. So education is key. And then, of course, supporting organizations that do this work. That's also very important.
And I want to thank you both so much for having this conversation. I think that uplifting this topic, which isn't talked about enough, is also really helpful as we talk about education. And so I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to have this really important conversation with me. And I think that that's a wonderful place to sign off here. So thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you once again, Heather and Michelle, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.